Have you ever wondered what it actually takes to buy back a country's freedom? I mean, we usually think of 1945 as the end of World War II, right? The immediate beginning of peace in Europe, but what if I told you that for Austria, 1945 was really just the starting line of a grueling, decade-long struggle? It wasn't just about surviving the physical aftermath of a war, it was about navigating this massive, fierce geopolitical chessboard just to reclaim their own sovereignty.
So, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving deep into some truly fascinating source material, detailing Austria's complex journey to the 1955 State Treaty. We're going to explore exactly how this nation navigated post-war devastation, super intense Cold War tensions, and, frankly, some absolutely massive economic burdens to finally achieve true independence. All right, let's jump right in.
Section 1. Liberation and Allied Occupation. Okay, picture this. It's April 1945. Allied forces sweep through Austria, liberating the country from the National Socialist dictatorship. But this liberation, it came with a pretty bittersweet reality. The Republic declared its independence, sure, but the Allies didn't pack up and leave. Just like the rest of the country, the capital city of Vienna was literally carved up into 4 distinct occupation zones. You had the US, the French, the British, and the Soviet Union. Only that first district, right in the center, was managed jointly. Imagine your own hometown divided up by foreign militaries who, let's be honest, didn't exactly trust each other.
So what was everyday life like in this divided land? In a word, claustrophobic. Even though Austria technically had a government, the Allied Council held absolute veto power over any laws they tried to pass. And getting around? Forget about it. If you wanted to travel to see family in another zone, you couldn't just hop on a train. No way. You needed a special 4-language identity paper, an Identitätsausweis, plus a travel permit. On top of that, the airwaves weren't even their own. The Allies completely controlled the media, broadcasting competing propaganda on stations like the US-run Rot-Weiss Rot or the Soviet Radio Wien.
Moving on to Section 2, Rebuilding a Shattered Nation.
Beyond that suffocating political control, the physical and economic reality on the ground was just staggering. With so many men still missing, wounded, or locked up as prisoners of war, the immense, back-breaking work of clearing rubble from these bombed-out streets fell largely on the shoulders of women. As our source material points out, these women suddenly became the primary breadwinners. They were physically pulling their shattered cities back together, literally brick by brick.
But here's the thing. Clearing rubble doesn't put food on the table, right? Cities faced extreme hunger. People were actually forced into what were called hamsterfarten, basically traveling way out to the countryside to barter whatever valuables they had left just to eat. Meanwhile, a massive black market was booming. The real lifeline eventually came from the outside. Organizations started sending care paquetes, and crucially, the US injected a staggering $1 billion into the Western zones through the Marshall Plan. That influx of cash was absolutely vital in helping the Austrian economy finally stand back up.
Section 3. Confronting the Nazi Past.
Now, as the country physically rebuilt, it also had to confront its very recent, very dark history through a process called denazification, or Entnazifizierung. Our source material gives a really objective look at how complex and messy this process actually was. The NSDAP was immediately banned, and laws were passed to punish war criminals. But how it was applied, highly debated. High-ranking officials were punished, but the laws separated members into different categories. Get this, about 90% of former members were classified as minor bellistae, or lesser offenders. By 1948, those individuals were granted amnesty. Because of this sweeping early amnesty, experts cited in the sources often describe this early denazification process as partially failed, or at least heavily incomplete.
And that brings us to a fascinating evolution in how the country remembered its own history. Right after the war, in 1945, the newly formed republic leaned heavily on this narrative that they were purely a victim of Nazi Germany. They even used the 1943 Moscow Declaration to back this up, since the Allies themselves had called Austria the first free country to fall victim to Hitler. But, well, this narrative entirely omitted the active participation of many Austrian citizens in the war. Actually, scratch that, it wasn't until the 1980s, and then officially in the 1990s, that the state finally shifted away from this Opfermythos, this victim myth, and formally acknowledged the shared responsibility of its citizens.
Section 4. Neutrality as the key.
So, while they were dealing with all this domestic rebuilding and historical reckoning, the Austrian government was desperately trying to get the occupying powers to just leave. But they were caught smack in the middle of a global standoff. Treaty talks actually kicked off in 1947, but they hit a brick wall almost immediately. The Cold War was heating up, and neither the US nor the Soviets wanted to pull their troops out and risk the other side sweeping in. That deadlock dragged on for years. It wasn't until 1953, when Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin died, that the political landscape finally shifted. By April 1955, a massive diplomatic breakthrough happened in Moscow, setting the stage to finally sign the treaty in May. So what exactly broke that years-long deadlock? The answer was the Swiss model. You see, the Soviet Union had an absolute, non-negotiable condition for withdrawing their troops. Austria had to declare immerwährende Neutralität, perpetual neutrality. The Soviets saw West Germany joining NATO and wanted an ironclad guarantee that Austria wouldn't do the same. By officially committing to never join a military alliance and never host foreign military bases, Austria finally got all four powers to agree.
And that sets the stage for one of the most famous, iconic moments in Austrian history. On May 15, 1955, after 10 long years of foreign occupation, Foreign Minister Leopold Figl stepped out onto the balcony of Schloss Belvedere. He held up the newly signed state treaty and declared, "Österreich ist frei." Austria is free.
The jubilation in that moment was just overwhelming. Thousands upon thousands of people were packed together outside the palace, waving flags, cheering, crying. For every single person in that crowd, it meant the foreign troops were finally going home. They were a sovereign nation once again.
Which brings us to Section 5, the price of freedom.
Because here's the catch. This freedom, as joyous as it was not just handed over for free. The Soviet Union demanded a staggering financial exit fee, $150 million. That was the bill. During the occupation, the Soviets had seized massive amounts of what they considered German property. We're talking entire factories, businesses, and resources in their zone. To get those assets back under Austrian control, the state treaty required Austria to deliver $150 million worth of goods to the Soviet Union over a grueling 6-year period.
And honestly, it didn't even stop at goods. The Soviet Union also demanded Erdölablöselieferungen, basically oil ransom deliveries. Since they controlled Austria's eastern oil fields, they demanded a massive cut on their way out the door. For the first several years, Austria was forced to ship 1 million tons of domestic crude oil per year directly to the USSR. Even when that amount was later reduced, our sources showed this specific oil agreement ended up costing the Austrian state a mind-boggling 2.67 billion shillings. That is a truly monumental price tag for a country that was still trying to find its economic footing.
Section 6, a new Austrian identity. Surviving a decade of occupation, navigating between global superpowers, and paying this immense ransom, it fundamentally changed the country. They really began building a modern, highly distinct sovereign nation. On October 25th, the very last foreign troops left, and the very next day, October 26th, Parliament passed the neutrality law. That day has been celebrated ever since as their national day. They actively separated their identity from Germany, which was bolstered by huge cultural milestones, like the glorious reopening of the State Opera in 1955. They even found new pride in sports, like grabbing third place in the 1954 World Cup. And, while strictly maintaining that military neutrality, they successfully integrated into Europe, eventually joining the EU in 1995.
Which brings us to our final thought. Austria didn't just stumble into freedom. They negotiated for it, they worked for it, and they quite literally bought it. That hard-won perpetual neutrality helped turn Vienna into a global hub for diplomacy and the UN. So, I'll leave you with this. How does that grueling 10-year struggle for independence and the incredibly high price they paid for that neutrality continue to shape Austria's unique role on the global stage right now? It's definitely something to think about the next time you hear about a major peace summit happening in Vienna. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.